Welcome, everyone. My name's Dr. Laura Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate people about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's faculty and educator workshop is entitled, "What Would You Bring?" Narrating Difficult Histories in the Classroom, and features the Brooklyn-based playwright and producer Kendall Pickney. It's our hope that this workshop will serve as the basis for a broader student initiative during the next academic year, so please absolutely let us know what you think afterwards. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, was first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are, mass atrocities and genocide. And these horrors continue to have devastating political, social, psychological, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. Two important notes. First, today's session is being held in a meeting format, so you will all be able to interact with one another. It is also being recorded and will be posted on the KHC's public website so that other people can view it at a later date. By participating today, you agree that your name and image will be visible now and in future viewings of this program. If you're not comfortable with this, we ask that you kindly sign off and watch the recording, which will be posted to our website in approximately 1 to 2 weeks after it's been captioned. Second, here at the KHC, we value creating spaces to dialogue across difference and engage with multiple viewpoints. We expect all participants to engage with curiosity, respect, and professionalism, including in chat, Q&A, and other interactive features. Now, to kick things off, it's my pleasure to introduce QCC English professors Allison Cimino and Victoria Tomasulo, whom the KHC is partnering with on this initiative. Professor Cimino is one of the 2025-26 KHC National Endowment for the Humanities Faculty Fellow. She teaches composition and creative writing at QCC as a full-time lecturer in English and holds an MFA from Texas State University. Her poems have appeared in Hunger Mountain Review, 30 Days, The Best of the 3030 Project, Ibbetson Street, Oberon Magazine, and other journals. Professor Victoria Tomasulo is a doctoral lecturer of English at Queensborough Community College with a background in comparative literature, women's studies, and Italian diaspora studies. A published poet and scholar, she regularly uses creative arts-informed approaches in her teaching of writing and literature. Allison and Victoria, the floor is yours.
Hello, I'm going to begin by speaking a bit about what would you bring and introduce you to. This is an interdisciplinary writing initiative that will begin at QCC this fall. And it's inviting students to narrate personal and familial histories of forced migration and to imagine the objects that they will bring or would bring if they were forced to flee from their homes. So drawing from his background in theater, Kendall Pinkney will discuss how educators can create safe spaces for difficult conversations in the classroom and share techniques for facilitating deep listening among participants. The English department has adopted a welcome read curriculum that's aligned with the What Would You Bring initiative. Other departments can use Pinkney's workshop model to facilitate deeper learning in their disciplines. This initiative will culminate in a college-wide, student-centered event that showcases diasporic memories through objects. Okay, so now Allison Cimino will introduce Kendall. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Laura, Barana, the KHC, and to all of you who are here today. And especially, we warmly welcome Kendall Pickney, who is with us today as our speaker. Kendall Pinkney is a Brooklyn-based theater maker, creative producer, and rabbi. He works and creates art at the intersections of race, religion, identity, and sacred text. His creative work has been presented or developed with organizations and venues such as The Team, the Mercury Store, Theater J, Feinstein's 54 Below, Joe's Pub, the National Opera Center of America, Musical Theater, Two Rivers Theater, and Godspeed Opera House. A frequent keynote speaker, he has presented at numerous conferences across the United States and Canada and was among the first rabbis honored to offer a multi-faith invocation for the 110th First Ladies Luncheon honoring Dr. Jill Biden. He continues to consult with a variety of media outlets, as well as arts and civic institutions on Jewish and Jew of color representation. He is the recipient of the 2023 IDEA Residency at Opera America and recently completed a commission to write a new play as part of Theater J's Expanding the Canon initiative. Kendall serves as the Director of Jewish Learning and Artist in Residence for Reboot. He is also the founding artistic director of The Workshop, a New York-based arts and culture fellowship that supports the work of professional artists of Black, Indigenous, people of color, Jewish heritage, including the online exhibition, What Would You Bring? A Reboot production, which has inspired this collaboration between the Kupferberg Holocaust Center and QCC's English department. Please welcome Kendall Pinkney.
Hello, everyone, and Allison, Victoria, Laura, thank you so much for having me here, for inviting me. I'm really excited to be with you and excited to share a little bit about this work that Reboot has been doing around sharing the stories of migrants, refugees, and it's work that Reboot has been doing for a long time. But especially with this project, What Would You Bring, is a project that started up in 2021. So I want to give a little bit of an explanation for what we're going to do in the remainder of our time together. Firstly, I'm going to give a little bit of a lecture, and we'll have a bit of Q&A peppered throughout. Then after that, we're going to take some time to actually do a workshop where you are going to get to bring yourself to this project and think about how is it that it relates to you? How is it that you might be able to bring it into your classroom or wherever it is that you spend your time, either via work or volunteering, and engage communities around these very important questions of migration, belonging, and the stories that we carry with us. All right, so with that being said, we will go ahead and launch into the sharing part. And I will, if you find yourself unmuted, I might go ahead and mute you just so that way we can get through this piece. But once we get to the Q&A, feel free to ask questions. All right, so here we go. What would you bring? So first, a little bit about Reboot. I know that I've said that it's a Jewish arts and culture organization, but a little bit more behind it is that it's actually a nonprofit that was co-founded by Steven Spielberg and Kate Capshaw's Righteous Persons Foundation approximately 23 years ago. And Reboot, we serve as an idea incubator and thought leader for contemporary Jewish cultural expression. Now, to get more specifically to how it is that What Would You Bring came about as a project, I will need to turn us to this picture right here. So maybe you've seen this picture. You might have seen it a handful of years ago in the New York Times or any number of other outlets. And I'm going to read a quote from the founder of the project, Juliet Simmons, who happens to be a Reboot Network member, as to what motivated this project. This is what Juliet says. I can't get the image of a woman handing her baby to soldiers over a barbed wire fence in Kabul out of my head. How desperate do you have to be to do that? How fearful do you have to be to cling to a moving airplane whilst being shot at? This is what is happening in plain sight right now. As our living rooms are filled with these images, we are bearing witness to just how quickly a hate-filled force can reinvade a country and re-imprison its own peoples, women and children included. It's overwhelming. I feel a sickening sense of deja vu each time I turn on the television. I wonder if this is what it felt like for my grandfather in 1938 when he was forced to flee Vienna. He got out in time to escape the knock on the door that would inevitably lead him to being rounded up and taken to a camp. He couldn't take a plane or a train, and in the chaos of conflict was forced to cross borders without visas. Eventually, he made his way to the UK. And here is Juliet, who wrote so poignantly about seeing that picture of the baby being handed to US soldiers over concertina wire on top of a fence. So Juliet saw this picture. She felt that there was a connection to her own story, her own family story, and decided that she wanted to partner with Reboot in order to produce a project that would get at that experience of being a refugee, a descendant of refugees, and finding ways to connect Jewish stories to broader stories in the world. And the way in which we got to that was through producing What Would You Bring for World Refugee Day in 2021. Now, we've said like a word or two about what would you bring, but I imagine that you're wondering, okay, what exactly did you produce? So what we're going to do in the next, it's probably going to be about 7 or so minutes, is I'm actually going to pause the PowerPoint. I'm going to show you one of the many videos that's kind of a proof of this concept. And then I'll also share another story that has some really poignant art that is a second refugee story. And then we'll come back together. We'll finish out the presentation.
Hello, my name is Haydee Argent, and this is my story. On my 8th birthday, 9 months before the Anschluss, I was given this very, very large doll. The doll came with a little suitcase full of clothes, and all the clothes were like my clothes, exactly the same. My grandmother was a dressmaker, and she had made all my clothes. And so when she knew I was going to have this big doll, she made a set of clothes for her, which were exactly like my clothes. I was the only Jewish child in the class in school, and other children didn't play with me. I knew that was because I was Jewish. The doll was my playmate for a lot of the time, you know, and I dressed her and I undressed her. She wasn't my baby. I never wanted a baby or a baby sister or a sibling. She was my friend. I loved her because she had such kind brown eyes, deep brown. I can see them to this day. And she just looked so kind. She came with not only with a suitcase with her clothes, but she came with another little kind of bag that had a baby doll in it that was her doll, but was an absolute replica of her. I wasn't allowed to bring my big doll, of course. We could only take one small suitcase each, and the things that had to go in it were necessities. No valuables could be taken. But I was allowed to take one toy and one book, and I couldn't take this big doll. There was just no way. So I brought her little doll, little Susie. We had no money left by that time because my father was a lawyer, and his office was requisitioned the first week after the Anschluss, and no home. They turned us out of our home as well. We were ordinary people leading ordinary lives when all this happened. Being an only child, I was very privy to adult conversation from a very early age. I knew exactly what anti-Semitism meant, and I knew it meant people didn't like me because I was a Jew, and it was as simple as that. At the time of the Anschluss, I knew exactly what was happening because it had been talked about so much. The fear of what was going to happen was so much part of our everyday life. And when it happened, it just seemed that that was it. And I was terrified all the time. It took us 1.5 years to get any kind of visas to get out. And there were 3 trains. We had to change twice. And each time we had to get out, and they took me away from my parents. They searched me on my own. And I remember them saying to me, "Have your parents hidden anything inside you?" And I said, "What?" I didn't even know what they meant. It was very unpleasant. We were always terrified. My mother and I were always terrified. And the train coming out was the last straw. It was all Jews in the train. It was an immigrant train. It was, full of immigrants. Things were so bad. I mean, it's difficult to convey how bad and how scary and how frightening it all was. Although I adored this doll, when I'm told you can't take her, she's too big, it wasn't the end of the world for me. It wasn't the most terrible thing that happened. We left so much behind. And I didn't mourn her when we got to England. I was so busy trying to become an English girl. It wasn't that important. I mean, in a way, little Susie became more important. She stood for something else, for loss in general. And I think she was quite important to my children because it kind of was my story, which they knew. And then my children had her, and then my grandchildren had her. And I used to take her to the museum, to Beit Shalom, when I was talking, and I used to hand her round, and the children would look at her. And I tell the children about this present that I had on my 8th birthday. I tell them my story from 8 to 10, which was, from just before the Anschluss, and then all the things that happened after the Anschluss. What I really talk about is refugees today, and I try and get them to think about what it means to be a refugee, and that very little has changed, and how do they view refugees, and what do they do when somebody comes into their class who can't speak English properly, and who wears different clothes and has different food at home. And then the museum got very antsy about all this and said, "No, you can't keep doing this because she'll fall to bits. She's so fragile. We want to put her in the museum, Can we please have her for the museum?" So anyway, they persuaded me to let little Susie go and live in the museum. So that's where she lives now.
So that was the story of Heidi Argent, animated by Steven Zluyo, about her experience being a refugee and fleeing from Vienna. So we also have another story by Ethiopian and now Ethiopian Israeli artist Avishai Mekonnen about the process of his family escaping Ethiopia, where as his family made it into Sudan, he was actually kidnapped and drugged and was missing from his family for 3 weeks and ultimately reconnected with them before flying with his family to Israel in 1984. And in his case, he talks about the things that he brought with him from Ethiopia, his blanket, his mother's coffee pot. And as anyone who knows anything about Ethiopian or Eritrean society, you know exactly how important coffee is to the culture, almost to a ritual point. And he also brought his father's prayer book, and those things brought him a sense of happiness. So now that I've shared those, I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint. Okay. And so those are just a couple of stories that this project presents. And as you can already tell just from hearing Heidi talk about her story, we are very open to the possibility and even encouraging that. Let me start my video. There we go. And encouraging of the fact that these stories have broader relevance and can also tie into the stories of other people and other histories. And one of the things that we like to do at Reboot is to think about ways to deepen the storytelling, deepen the connection to the Jewish storytelling, but also see the ways in which it connects beyond Jewish communities. But now let's get to the point of today. How is it that we narrate difficult histories in the classroom, especially when the classroom has potentially become more fraught than ever. So I only have maybe 3 simple but maybe challenging points to make on this. And okay, let me go forward. So one of the ways to narrate difficult histories in the classroom is to make these stories, make these histories multimodal. One of the things that is, I won't say that it's challenging, but I would say it's commonplace actually around telling stories connected to the Holocaust, telling stories connected to, honestly, many atrocities around the world, is that often they're in an effort to best convey the story in its honesty and in its historical oral with historical and oral fidelity, there can often be a leaning into just letting the story speak for itself. However, one of the things that I've often found working with students in kind of experiential learning environments, but also in traditional environments, is that students will often need different ways of getting into stories. There are some for whom hearing a story and seeing a person sitting before them will be enough to pull them in. But there are others for whom that's simply not enough to kind of break through the barrier of just, a person's psyche, to say nothing of students who might have audio processing difficulties. So I think that having multimodal approaches to telling these difficult histories is really important, as you can see with our projects that we did. And if you go to the actual website, you can see we have a number of stories where there's video, there's animation, different forms of animation, there's evocative music. And even in the cases where we are actually telling a story through writing and through a narrative, you saw how in Avishai's story, things were broken up into, okay, here's a paragraph, and then here is some really evocative artwork. In the case of Avishai's story, the artwork was provided by the artist Sophie Herxheimer. So thinking about all of the modalities that you might want to use in order to land a story, in order to make it more relevant. I know that in some of the work that I've done in local school districts in New York, for example, in the Westchester schools, by virtue of going into the schools and actually starting to tell a story as a performance, because my background is as a theater maker, suddenly students who maybe weren't so interested to learn about a story representing Jewish American Heritage Month, they see me launch into a storytelling mode, launch into performance mode, and then learn about my background as a theater maker. And suddenly they're paying a little more attention. They're leaning forward. They're more open to the possibilities of learning about my history or the challenging histories that, I'm presenting. So that's point number 1. Try to make these stories multimodal. Okay, number 2. Move from the personal to the skill building to the personal. This is actually a point that came up in the wonderful dialogue that I had with Victoria and Allison about what it is we were going to present here. One of the things that was realized is that this is not the first storytelling program that draws on using a concrete material object in order to tell a personal story that is connected to a difficult history. But one of the things that I think that What Would You Bring maybe does slightly differently than some others is that it actually has a low barrier to entry for students. And as we'll see through the workshop that we do a little bit later, we just ask people to think about, what is your personal connection here? What is something that you would bring? Now, we don't immediately say, what is something that you would bring, and immediately use a particular kind of genre or form, like say, put it in a poem, or use the form of ode, or put it in a particular essay form. What we actually do is start from the place of just identify an object. What is your connection to that object? And then after doing that work, I think that our modules can partner really well with some of the work that you do in your classrooms to think about, okay, now that the students have engaged from a personal level and started to build rapport amongst themselves, Now, how do we go to skill building? What is it that someone who teaches social studies can actually do in order to integrate a personal story with a skill building exercise? The same for an English teacher, the same for a teacher in the broader arts. And then what you ultimately want to do is bring that skill building piece back to the personal. So, as we often know with education, reflection is a really important part of solidifying the knowledge that is gained. So making sure that you bring the skill building to tie it back into the personal piece that students identified in the first place is really essential. So that is point number 2 that I want to make. Now, point number 3, I want to actually start with a quote from one of my favorite scholars of critical literacy, Paulo Freire. He said, reading the world precedes reading the word, and the subsequent reading of the word cannot dispense with continually reading the world. Language and reality are dynamically intertwined. The understanding attained by critical reading of a text implies perceiving the relationship between text and context. So this quote all points to that previous point that I was making, that moving from the personal to the skill building back to the personal, I think is the useful cycle of doing this, because ultimately students are bringing their personal experience into every class that they take. And to ignore the personal experience or to immediately force students to go into a place of using craft or using genre can sometimes be off-putting. So there we have it. And now I'll move on to the final point. And this is about how is it we be mindful in engaging students with this work. So the point is connection, not trauma dumping. So one of the aspects of, I would say, equity in the classroom is to make sure that we are not requiring so much of students in terms of sharing their stories that we ultimately end up re-traumatizing them or asking them to engage their trauma in order to perform a kind of academic exercise. So one of the things that's really important as you think about how is it that I do this, how do I engage students in this kind of thinking and skill building and storytelling, is to make it very clear up front that they actually have choice with how much it is that they reveal in a story, how much it is that they reveal in an exercise. If it feels like too much in order to talk about a migration story, a refugee story, that's actually okay. For example, if you want to choose something that you brought with you from home, you could actually choose something that sparks joy as opposed to something that necessarily takes you to a place of thinking about like, oh, everything it is that I have lost. But then there will be some others who will be quite comfortable and quite willing to go there. So always make it very clear that the point is connecting personal experience to skill building and building that within an academic community. It is not trauma dumping. So those are 3 points that I wanted to make about the work that we've done in building out what would you bring and working with communities. Now, I've spoken for, I don't know, approximately 20 minutes or something like that, and I already know that there must be certain questions, concerns, and things that are coming up. So we're actually going to take a little pause for a Q&A before jumping into the workshop piece and seeing what it is that really looks like inside of your communities. So I will go ahead and stop share. Your questions and concerns, you can put them in the chat. Allison and Victoria and others might help me with those questions and make sure that I don't miss something. And we'll just take several minutes to address some questions from experiences that I've had doing this workshop and working with communities over the years. So, all right, I'll shut up and let you ask your questions. So, first question, how do we define an object for the purpose of the What Would You Bring initiative? Great question. And I would encourage as broad a definition as possible, but ultimately something that is material. Either it takes up physical space, because I do think that there is something about the physical space of being able to hand something, pass something around a classroom? Or if it is not necessarily physical, can it be a video? Yes, it can be a video. That is something that has worked really well in classrooms, so long as it's something really small and manageable. For example, I have a dear friend who happens, a Canadian friend who is Jamaican heritage and has a Georgian Jewish mother. And she and her brother were actually like national figure skating champions in Canada growing up. They were partners, and they had what she credits as to some of her success was that she and her brother had to take Georgian dance growing up, which anyone who knows about Georgian dance knows that that is a serious tradition. So in that case, she has sometimes brought about like a video of her and her brother doing Georgian dance in a very serious way. So that is also something that could absolutely be material culture that is worth sharing. So leave it broad, but something that people can see, touch, smell, feel. I would maybe move people away from identifying a story as your object, because ultimately you want to tell the story about the thing. So maybe less of the story as an object, unless you are bringing a book. And this book has this story in it, and this is my connection to the story. So that's how we've defined it. But also happy to see if you want to experiment with this and you find something different, do it. Let us know how it works. We are very happy to change. The next hand I see is Jill.
Yeah, so I do a variation on this activity, but and that's why I wanted to come. I like the idea of what would you bring, because that leaves something more open-ended.
Right.
So here's why. So what I do is, what have you inherited? But here's what I've encountered. Okay. At CUNY anyway, so I'm speaking as CUNY faculty right now.
Great.
At CUNY, many of our students.
And Jill, could you also share your department, just so that way everyone has a little more context around it as well?
I'm at BMCC, and it's Speech Communications Theater Arts, so I use this.
Great.
Well, I use it all my communications, because it is about storytelling, but especially for our recent immigrant students, I've found that I've had to broaden my definition of object or inheritance, because some of our students get here somehow with the clothes on their backs, and it can be shaming not to have something. For myself, I say, well, a recipe, right? So you have this recipe in you, a song, right? Maybe somebody taught you a dance, and then they can perform, or the music, or sing, or make the meal, the dish, or or at least show us them record themselves making the dish and telling the story. Anyway, speaking from a CUNY perspective, object can be stressful. Coming up with something can be stressful. Also, sometimes they've left it in their home countries for a whole variety of reasons, right?
Sure. Yeah. I think that's a really solid point. And ultimately, you all are experts of your communities. And I think it's really essential that, even in sharing this program, that we kind of defer to your expertise of your communities and your student body. And you all might know better than I do, as someone who has not been with your students, what might induce shame. So ultimately, the ways in which you might need to expand this, I really do defer to you. I think that your example of a recipe is great. In the event that they can actually bring something that we can taste, see, and smell, even better. But ultimately, talking with the student to see if, ultimately just writing it down might be the only thing that feels accessible due to resources and capacity. then that is fine. Ultimately, I think it is true. You do not want anyone feeling overly anxious, overly stressed about their ability to produce a thing. In as much as you can have physical objects in the room, I do think it yields a richer experience, but truly, I defer to you and your expertise of your communities. Should we guide students toward culturally significant objects and away from commercial products? My initial response is yes, but then there are some cases in which an iPhone can actually hold like the storytelling power for someone. Like there have been times when I've encountered young people who are like, the first iPhone I got, like they bring, like in some cases they actually have an iPhone like 5 or 6, and you're like, oh, this actually does something for you and does some cultural work for you. So I think the thing that I ultimately try to avoid, and it's always a graceful or sometimes not so graceful dance, is like, I try not to essentialize the notion of like culturally significant versus insignificant, and try not to use the dichotomy of like commercial versus non-commercial, because sometimes really poignant stories can come from the commercial. I think what I often do in order to lead people to the significance of the storytelling is like, look, you can choose the iPhone, you can choose the iPad or something like that, but I really want you to think about like what is the story there? How is this something about like not only what you have brought, but what you would bring, and how is it doing that cultural work? So like yes and kind of complicated noodly answer. Okay, got you. How would we make, what would you bring relevant for BIPOC students whose family members are not immigrants or who may feel cut off from ancestral histories? Yeah, this is really solid question. So it's student to student, person to person. I think one thing that could be really important is, I'm sure that you already use office hours in a variety of ways, but in as much as you have capacity and time, or if you have a TA to like make yourself available to think with people through this process, like I'm a person who grew up Black in the South. And while I do have certain family histories and narratives, and there is a reality of kind of like an ancestral history that I'm cut off from, but I kind of immediately know what are the things that I would choose. But I can't know that for others. So I think you're being available to students to help them think through those difficult pieces can be really helpful. One other thing that I've seen in communities, and I don't know if you're seeing it in your classrooms, but this is something that I've had to work with, is working class white or pass for white students. Like sometimes getting them to not necessarily respond by saying, I don't have anything, I just have a boring reality, boring story, and sometimes even middle class white students, like, there's nothing there, it's boring. Okay, Italian grandmother here, Irish grandparent there, I don't have anything, I'm not interesting. I often like to push students, especially those who might be told that their backgrounds aren't interesting, to think about like, well, no, you arrived here with some specificity that is just your story. No one has exactly your story. So what are the specific histories you bring from your nonna? What are the specific histories that you bring from this other grandparent or a parent? Like we need to not helping them not frame it as, oh, interesting versus uninteresting, but rather personally significant. And how is it that you relate those stories to the stories of your other classmates who may come from elsewhere and may have a more complicated and refugee story? Because I've often found that if you can start to get these students to think that way, then they're starting to connect their own stories with the broader community. And that's a big goal of this project. Okay. May need to offer more students' choice, yes, to avoid essentializing cultural identities. Absolutely. One thing that I often say about my cultural identities as someone who's Black from the South and also has Afro-Indigenous family from Belize, the Garifuna people, is like, I hold on to my cultural histories in a meaningful way, but I also realize that I have to like hold it a bit loosely to avoid even essentializing my own stories and then mapping it onto other people who might have a similar background to me. A question: what kind of multimodal exercises have you used? So I think one thing that we will think about in the workshop is what are the modalities that you all necessarily have access to by virtue of your specialties. So one thing that I've especially used as a playwright is storytelling, developing, like I've even done a weeks long workshop with certain communities where we develop the equivalent of like a 3-minute personal monologue that is based around some piece of material culture from students' backgrounds. I have colleagues who have worked with visual arts, who have worked with multidisciplinary art. We also have music. I have a dear friend who is a Turkish American immigrant who will often take students into experiences of almost doing like a found, how does Avi describe it? It's like found cultural soundscape. Like, so if you think about a piece of material culture, obviously like, okay, great. I want to abstract that and think about what are the sounds of where you're from. What are the sounds for him? He's like, here are the sounds of Istanbul to me. And then here are the sounds of Buffalo, New York, where my parents landed. And so he locates sounds that are connected to childhood memories for him, and then weaves that into a complete non-narrative experience. So if you're someone working in music, maybe that is a modality that you might want to use. And I would say that that could be almost like a substitute for like an actual physical piece of a physical something that you bring into class. All right, maybe time for one more question for now before we actually transition into the workshop piece.
Ask a quick
Okay,
question, actually,
absolutely.
about just the logistical aspect. So, and how it works
Yes,
with scaffolding. So, you invite students to recall a memory or something of an object of what they would bring. Then is there a sharing where they bring something in and then you move into like maybe a next session, or like is this something that you do in like a 50-minute time period? I just want to know a little bit more about
sure.
the nuts and bolts of how it works, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. The nuts and bolts are variable. There have been, I have done this in as little as 50 minutes, and I have done it in as much as like 3 times over the course of a week with a student group. So, one of the things that you will all receive as part of participating in this workshop is you'll actually receive the module that we have designed to plug and play, along with descriptions of how it is you do everything. But one of the things that we often do is we usually do a little bit of prep and get people to plan on bringing in an object. This is like our base level. This is not the advanced like sound, experience that my friend Avi does when using this. Bring in an object. You're going to have a bit of time to talk about why it is you brought that object. There will be a bit of a share, often done in small groups. This is something that we're actually going to do momentarily, as we imagine what we might do. Then you come back together and you actually there are 2 different ways that we do it. You can actually write a bit of a narrative as to why you brought this and kind of create a bit more form around it. So kind of like the 3-minute monologue. Why is it that you brought a cheese grater? Okay, this is what it means. And here is what I find interesting about it. This is how it connects to my story. Here's why I would bring it if I needed to leave, because of a threatening situation. And then there is also the possibility of doing like a visual version of it. Like one picture that I'll show you in a little bit is that we actually have a prompt where we actually have students who are actually more into like art and drawing, like actually draw what it is that they would bring inside of a suitcase. And so that is something that even students who aren't necessarily great at drawing can at least appreciate, the other artistic modality of having to draw something on a piece of paper and, connecting it, sight, mind, storytelling, heart. And then you always bring it back to sharing. Like when we've done this, when I did a version of this at one of the Westchester schools, I think one of the interesting things that the ultimate goal is like, how are students sharing with one another? And it was always fascinating to hear other students be like, like I knew, just to use a name, I knew Anne's story a bit, but I guess I didn't kind of know why this necklace that she wears, carries so much meaning for her. So it's kind of cool to now be privy to that story. So the thing that is essential, ultimately, an object and some kind of artistic engagement or modality, and then the sharing. And ultimately, you get to decide what makes sense for your community and not, because admittedly, in some cases, it just might not work, and you are experts of your community.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so now, enough talking about nuts and bolts and things like this. One of the things that I often think about, especially as someone who teaches regularly in a variety of settings, is like sometimes we need to actually do the things ourselves. We need to have a little bit more skin in the game. So we're going to actually take a little bit of time and do one of the exercises. And I will go ahead and show the instructions on the screen. So here we are. So exercise 1. On one side of your page, you can actually see one of the activities from our module that you will all get a copy of. It actually shows the objects that all of the various storytellers, the refugees, told in a story format, whether video or written. And then it says compare one of those objects with objects featured in the with an object that you would choose. So what is your object and how does it compare to the objects of these stories that you saw? So we're going to actually spend just a little bit of time doing this exercise. All right. So I'll just go ahead and read it for the sake of ease. Think back to Heidi Argent's story of her doll that accompanied her along her refugee journey. What you're now going to do is take 2 to 3 minutes to identify an object that you would bring in your suitcase if you had to move to another country tomorrow. If you've had experience with this, you can feel free to use something that you or your family actually did bring. After these 2 to 3 minutes, we're going to split you into breakout groups of approximately 4-ish people, and you're just going to share what it is that you decided. Once again, you only share what feels comfortable to share in a community like this that is being built around, one afternoon. So if you don't want to go that deep, please feel free not to go that deep, but please do tell about something. And I think that we'll probably give each person about 2 minutes or so to share once we go off into our breakout rooms. So, all right. Is this pretty clear what it is that we're trying to do? I'm going to leave this up on the screen as we have our 2 to 3 minutes. And afterwards, we're going to go into breakout rooms for no more than 10 minutes. Then we're going to come back and we're going to have a little bit of a share. Okay. So 2 minutes starting now. So now we're actually going to we're doing really well on time. You all are absolutely getting out of here on time. So no worries about that, but we're really good on time. So we have a bit of time for sharing if there are maybe 2 or 3 people who would be interested in sharing. So, again, that question. What is the object that you would bring in your suitcase if you had to flee to another country tomorrow? Why did you choose this? What does it mean for you? All right. Robin, please kick us off.
Hi. So I actually raised my hand because I have a question, but I'm also
Okay.
willing to share. And
Okay.
I don't know
Sure.
whether I should present my object or like the group. It came up in our group, right?
I see. Yeah.
So my object was my father's Kiddush cup. And I selected it both because I feel like it connects me to a legacy, a heritage. My father learned jewelry making from his father, who learned it in Yemen before they had to run away. And my father's done jewelry his whole life. And so this Kiddush cup was made, crafted by him. But I also feel like for me personally, it is a tie to the memories of a childhood that was very much centered around religious practice, Shabbat dinners, holidays. But it's not like my object. And so here's the question, right? Is that okay? Like, we know that you're flexible and that you want
Yeah.
it to work for everybody, but I had trouble thinking of my own
Mm.
personal object. And so, yeah, I'm not
Yeah.
articulating well, but that's the question.
Oh no, that's a perfectly articulate question. The short answer is yes.
Okay.
Yeah, totally works. Like
Okay.
one of the things that I would bring, even though, now I am Jewish and I am a rabbi, but I grew up Christian, like I would absolutely like you give me, depending on the day you ask me, my grandmother's Bible is coming with me. So it's like, yeah, totally.
Thank you.
All right. So thank you, Robin, for starting us. Danny, please.
I don't actually have, I mean, I could share, but it was more of a question.
Okay.
I somewhat struggled in those 3 minutes to think of an object. And so I was
Mhm.
wondering, Kendall, like, would it be advisable, like, if I were to do this for my clients, to give this to my students as homework? I mean, I don't want them to overthink it at the same
Yeah.
time, but I'm also thinking, like, maybe give them a day or two to really kind of like search their memories. And I don't, I guess my question is, I mean, is it something that should be done in 3 minutes, or can having a little bit more time to process work as well?
Great question. I've seen it work well both ways, but also the very thing that you've named has definitely come up in certain cases where I come in for just a 50-minute session. And there are some people who it's like, I've got objects galore, and others for whom it's like, it felt like too much pressure, too little time. So I think in your case is because you all have longstanding relationships and a semester, I would imagine, to work with your students. Absolutely. Assign it as homework. Yeah, it's like get a day, 2 days, perfectly fine. It's, I think one of the things that I often want to do is just like, you don't want the pressure of like building up for a week, but you also don't want the pressure of like 3 minutes. In this
Yes.
case, the 3 minutes is more of it's an artificial construct just for us to get into it in this time. But absolutely, yeah, give it a day before, 2 days before, maybe not more than a week.
Hi.
Yeah, Victoria.
I So I had a struggle. I guess it was between the what would you bring if you had to leave, the urgency of that. I would think it
Yeah.
would have to be something that I couldn't live without, or that's really part of my daily life, that I would feel bereft, deprived.
Hmm.
And then the ancestral significance,
Hmm.
that others, this exercise seems to encourage more to choose culturally significant objects that
Yes.
were important to my ancestors. So I don't really need my grandmother's jewelry. I could live without it, or the letters she wrote in Italy. These things have sentimental value to me, right? But
Yes.
at the same time, if I had to leave, if I really were in that situation where I had to leave my home and go to a foreign country, I don't think that would be the first thing I would choose. Do you understand? Even though
Oh,
they have
absolutely.
sentimental value, I'd probably choose my journal. I went with my journal.
That's great. I mean,
So,
do you want to say even just a touch more about the journal, and then we'll kind of like touch on the piece that you led in with?
oh
Like,
yeah,
yeah,
the journal, because I'm taking notes on a creative project that I want to turn into a fictional biography. And if I were to have lost all that, I would be very upset.
sure.
But I'm not
Yeah,
very attached to objects, honestly. I'm not very
yes,
attached to jewelry and things of that nature, sentimental
sure.
heirlooms, knickknacks. I'm not.
Yeah, yeah. Makes perfect sense. And I think one of the things that's really fascinating about this project, and I think especially if you say if you have like a week and you can do like 2 or 3 modules on this, I think that you could even use the space to get into that very thing, because I think there are going to be people who very much identify with what you just said, and then others for whom it's like, I'm absolutely getting passport and heirlooms. Like I know that my partner, based on the fact that she has her grandmother's watch and her mother's opal necklace, that it's like heirlooms are coming with us. And so whereas for me, being a playwright, journal, I probably have a combination of both. But I do get your point about the fact that we have culturally significant things that tell an incredible story as part of this exercise. And so that can put a kind of pressure on us as educators and also on the students to be like, oh, it needs to be the things that matter. And this is where I think that the intervention of the teacher comes in. I often, when I'm leading this, like I do follow this, but just based on the community, like I'll change it up and say, like, okay, maybe it is maybe it is a journal, maybe it's a cassette tape. I think one of the funniest things, is it the theater director Igor Goliak, who's a refugee from Ukraine, is that he said, like, in kind of doing his theatrical work with refugees, like hearing them talk about like we needed to escape, I put a what was it? What was the funniest one? Was like a salami slicer, like a big heavy like metal salami slicer in a suitcase, and it's like, really, the salami, like, okay, I get the tool, but it's like the salami slicer. And the point that he often makes is sometimes we don't even know why we grab the things that we grab, but obviously it was doing some kind of work for us in that moment. And so I think it's kind of interesting, like when you are, and it's important for us to recognize the difference between when we are actually in the moment of needing to escape, we have no idea what will take over in terms of our selection process. This is just an encouragement, a way to get to thinking about some things which are culturally significant, but also the things that it's like, no, it's the journal. Actually, this doesn't mean so much to me. So I think your point is well taken.
Yeah, because I'm not really a sentimental person, honestly.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, this urgency to leave, I would think about something, and I think most people would, that something that they really need, or would be very upset to have left behind. Something that they're, yeah, that's, there's a difference between, the sentimental attachment to, say, an ancestor or grandparent, and then something that they would really, uh, yeah, would feel the loss of if they were to leave it behind.
Yeah,
That makes sense. So, yeah.
absolutely.
I was thinking that both, like allowing for both types of objects invites a
Mhm.
really interesting conversation. And even
Right,
just talking about it, I recall my
right.
own thought process because my initial very first thought, or among the first thought, was like a can opener. And then I thought, well, but then I thought my emotional thing go to, like if I needed comfort, would be like my mala, and I wrote about my
Mm,
prayers. So like it just was interesting to me to think like just the thought process alone creates a moment of empathy, of just the urgency
Mhm. Mhm.
right.
and getting resources and the fear around all of that. There's just so much fear and uncertainty around such a question, and to imagine what that would be like as well. and understanding that so many of our students have in fact had to go through this. So it's a really interesting exercise and conversation. So thank you so much.
Yeah. And like, I think this, I guess, module that we have, I mean, ultimately, we at Reboot, what are we quote unquote expert in? We're expert at arts and culture, storytelling stuff, but ultimately you are experts of your community. You have a more intimate relationship to your students and what works and what will the challenges be. And that's kind of one of the things in kind of the next, we'll have a little bit of an exercise where we won't go into breakout rooms. We're going to think about some of the challenges, but you all know what could be helpful and what would actually be a hindrance. And so I would encourage you all, like, it's one thing to like take, Heidi Argent's video and then splice it up in ways and then make it tell a story that is not her story. But in terms of like actually taking the content of the module that you'll receive, make it work for you. I think that something so rich can come from that juxtaposition of sentimental object, functional object, and then also in as much as we can make our spaces safe and structured enough for students who have had to experience fleeing somewhere, like, what is it that you did bring? What is it that you would have brought? Like, if we can make a space solid enough to contain that without it activating trauma, that can be just like a really precious conversation and intellectual exchange that can happen as well. But I don't want to overplay that because I know that it can be really difficult to achieve that, especially if you're only seeing students for 45 minutes or 50 minutes. Anyone else want to share? I think we have time for like one more share if someone wants to share an object, the why.
I'm a multi disciplined human, well, somewhat feral by nature. And my father and my brother-in-law built me a drafting table when I was like 20 years old, that I used for years. And I was allowed to become an artist with that and jewelry maker and that, but I would need a very large suitcase.
Right.
But that would be the one thing I would take. The drafting table, unfortunately, is in Lala is in has left my life
Mm,
due to other circumstances. So I would bring back that memory with that
mm,
fictional now table.
yeah,
Yeah. So yeah. So the
great.
beginnings of things. It was the beginnings of things. So it's yeah. It's weird. It's not. I mean, I'm American. I mean, I'm a third generation American citizen, even though I'm European roots.
Hmm.
So I don't have the memories that other people have from my aunts and uncles and generations past. They also come from a rabbi stock as well.
Mm,
Romanian, Hungarian, Ukrainian, and Austro-Hungarian. I mean, Austrian. So I'm a mutt.
yeah.
I'm a European mutt.
Hey, we dig the mutts. I mean, it's
Yeah, yeah.
as someone who is differently mutted,
Oh yeah.
I certainly can appreciate that. So, folks, what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the next exercise, which we're not going to be going into another breakout room. This is going to be a little bit of quiet reflection work, and it's going to lead us organically into more questions and thinking together with how we might use something like this. So, all right, let's go ahead and share. Exercise 2. So first things first, what you can see on part of the screen is, and you'll see this in the handout that's actually sent to you, is there are examples of what it is that the artists who did all of this wonderful artwork, what they brought, what they would have brought. So they did the exercise themselves, and that can be really lovely to engage with and to engage students on. But I want to go to something that I think is more relevant to who you all are and where it is you all work. you all work in different departments and bring different kinds of expertise to your work. So we're going to take probably on the no more than 5 minutes actually. Devise how you might incorporate this module into your syllabus. Okay? Identify course discipline specific obstacles that might limit your capacity to incorporate this project. And also bring more of your questions. So at the end of these 5 minutes, we're going to, one or two people might share how they think it would make sense to incorporate into their course. And then we're going to have time for questions, and then we're going to end for sure by our time limit. So, okay, I am going to, so incorporate and so for example, how would you incorporate the activity that we just did? Right, because when I say module, that's actually something much bigger. So you can actually think to what it is we've done. We did the exercise with the material object. You also saw the videos. And so let's just use those as two examples and think, how might I incorporate this? What would be the challenges? So just a little bit of a brainstorming exercise. All right, we're going to take 5 minutes to do that, max, and then a couple of people will share. Then we'll have some Q&A. All right, and I will put on a little bit of music. And if you don't like people seeing you thinking, you are welcome to go off screen. So I think one of the things that Victoria wrote holds very true. How to incorporate this is going to look very different for everyone. But I'm actually kind of like eager and excited that this might even be an invitation to like brainstorm and think about how it is you all might come together and kind of like, you know, create this wonderful web throughout your broader community. So just wanted to see if there were the beginnings, the sparks of how you might incorporate something based upon what your discipline, what you teach. And for those who I haven't heard, let me know, what is your department? What's your discipline? And kind of just these initial thoughts for how you might incorporate.
If everyone, I'm sorry to intervene, but if everyone could write their discipline and then maybe in the chat share whether or not you're interested in participating in this initiative. And what I mean by participating is, you know, having your students, you know, participate in this what would you bring activity through everything that Kendall had spoken about, the show, perhaps showing and telling, right? And either, you know, creating some kind of monologue or an artistic representation followed by sharing, and that leading to skill building. So something disciplinary specific to that. That's what I mean. It's going to look very different for people in faculty in different disciplines, but we will all be asking them ultimately that same question and having them choose an object. And I think that at least for me, I have worked with objects in the past in my classes. It might be useful to have students brainstorm even a list of objects and then narrow it down. That always works usually. And then even some of them need one-on-ones. It's the most difficult part is choosing the object, in my experience.
Always.
If you are interested, please let me know, because I would like to have a meeting as well before the fall semester, ideally with people from different departments. And we could have one in the middle of the semester and then maybe have some kind of event where we could have students from different departments and showcase works that grew out of this initiative. So I would really like this. Yeah.
Incredible. So Danny, I think I saw your hand up first.
Yeah, I feel like I have this easy. I teach English at QCC. Victoria, Allison, our colleague Beth, I think Noella. Well, yeah, a lot of my colleagues are on this from the English department. But in English 101 composition, that Julia, these are personal narratives, and their students are mostly writing personal essays. So I can see very easily having this as an assignment. But I also liked in that last after the breakout room, everyone was talking about the process of, deciding what object that they would take. I also like that as an assignment also in itself, where
Mm,
students do a free writing and just kind of think, if I were in this situation, what would I take? Why? I mean, just to kind of brainstorm and free writing to share those ideas and see that as kind of like a preliminary exercise leading up to the one that you gave us. Um,
yes,
the other thing that I was thinking, and I'm sorry that I'm talking too much. I'll shut up in a
it's
moment.
great.
Another thing that I was thinking about was English 102, but I'm kind of confused about not confused, conflicted about doing this. In English 102, a lot of the short stories that I teach, they usually have something to do with objects. Like for instance, I love teaching Alice Walker's Everyday Use, and
Mm.
at the center of that story are
Mhm.
those quilts. And so I was wondering if there was a way that I could tweak this in a fictionalized version. Like there's so many short stories and novels and poems that, we teach, and that maybe if students could take a character. I mean, because like when Dee goes home, Dee's taking everything, right?
Yeah.
She doesn't come home with a suitcase, but she might as well, because she's just walking through the house, this, and this. But I'm thinking about even things like William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily. Like if Miss Emily
Mm.
chose to take something from her house, but then Kendall, I'm not really sure if that stays true to the intent of this assignment. Because then again, it's not personal to the students; it's outside of the students. So that would
Yeah.
be my only conflict about doing that.
So I tend to be very open to possibilities. So I think that you're right. It's even if it's not true to the question of like, so this was founded for like started on refugee, day in 2021, and is connecting it to personal stories. However, and this was kind of I think what came up in a bit of the conversation with Victoria. It's like you all do have certain skills that you're trying to impart in benchmarks, and so I think that it's actually a matter of structuring this kind of in the way that I was thinking, like personal to skill building to personal. And I do think that that fiction has a role to play in that. So I don't see it as necessarily being incongruous. Like I think that it's just a matter of where do we build this in? Because in my case, as a kid who didn't have a ton of books in the house growing up, but I loved fiction when I got there. Like I was already bought into it. And then I know a number of friends and family members who are like, who cares if I read this story about this fictional thing? It's not, why is this worth my time? And so sometimes making that bridge between the personal to the fictional and how the fictional sometimes can help us explore the lives that we almost like can't live in our personhood. At least that's one way I think about it. Or even other lives. Like uh, I think that there are so many ways to kind of scaffold it to build up to that. And I think that as long as like if you are using this, as long as there is an acknowledgement kind of like of the original context, I don't really see any issue with ultimately pivoting to do what it is you need to do in order to deliver what you have promised students to be able to make it through English 101 or 102. It makes perfect sense to me. I think Robin.
Hi, sorry, I don't want to take up too much time, but Danny, I love the idea of using fiction, and I'm also English, plan on doing that too. I don't know why, the things they carried is popping up in my brain right now,
Mm,
right?
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
But I just
exactly.
kind of coming, leaping off of Kendall. I think this is a really great way to do it. Like I attended in the winter a workshop with Lincoln Center Education, and they have this whole aesthetic education practice where before you even read a text, they're asking you to do something that kind of replicates what they're going to see. I mean, I think in that sense, doing it before is asking them to think a little bit more of craft and challenge, whereas maybe introducing a story, like you could do it, I think, either
Yeah,
way. You could start having them think about an object, then read the story, then revisit, right? Or the opposite. And just because I'm at QC, I have the luxury of having a museum on campus. And there have been times where I've brought my students to the museum and I ask I mean, the times I've done it previously has been more cultural. So the museum director will bring out a cultural object, and I have my students sit and just write about it and what they think it means. And then we get this whole, some beaded fringe thing is so crucial to a particular culture. So there's always something beyond it to do, and whatever gets the students excited. So thank
Sure.
you, Kendall. Thank you, everybody. And yeah, Danny, I'm totally into the fiction thing too.
Yeah. And I think that it's also, I'm thinking out loud with this. This isn't something I've thought about a ton, but maybe one thing that I kind of go back on that what I said earlier is, starting with the personal and then proceeding to the thing that is skills building or doing something like in the do something that is like based in genre or based in like theater or something like that. What I'm almost wondering is like you all eventually get to know how to engage students and to kind of know what's the way to like connect. So there are some students for whom starting from the personal and then building up to the skill is going to be the way in. And then there are others who are like, I don't want to start with the personal thing. Just like give me the thing, give me the practice. And so for them, it's like, okay, you actually do need to you need to write this like a faux sonnet about this particular topic, and maybe it ties into something personal, maybe it doesn't. So I would defer to you all to maybe, who knows, maybe it's even an option of where it is you start. Just anything to like get the students to actually engage, because ultimately everyone's going to need to engage with the content in a meaningful way and demonstrate, if not mastery, at least engagement. But I just think there have to be multiple ways in. So Robin, you're saying that is making me kind of rethink, does it always need to start from the personal? I don't think it always does. It can start from the content and the form, but maybe offering an opportunity for students to choose where to get in. One thing I'm seeing just from the chat and thinking about AT, like it's true, biology, anatomy, physiology. I mean, where does this fit in? It's certainly more challenging, but maybe it's the fact that as a person who is a humanities major at a liberal arts college, like I had to take the science courses that were like the history of science or the history, like there are narratives that are woven into anatomy and physiology. It's just that obviously can't be the lion's share of what you focus on. So if we think about histories of, for lack of a better term, atrocities that have been perpetrated by virtue of narratives that people connected to anatomy and physiology throughout history. Well, suddenly, thinking about phrenology, someone's head, the bumps on someone's head. So there are ways that we can think about narrativizing biology, anatomy, and physiology. But I want to be very honest and be like, hey, that's not the first thing that you are focused on. So it might be a little more like figuring out how it is you're going to put this into your work. But regardless, I appreciate your being here to at least engage in the idea. So okay, there we go. Nervous system, there we go. All right, so definitely some story in there. All right. In our remaining time, other questions, thoughts, anyone else want to share about how they think it might work into their teaching or anything more interesting? Yeah, Victoria.
Yeah, I was just thinking, it's just an idea. I wanted to see what you thought for students, and there are always students in my classes who resist getting personal.
Yeah,
Um, could it be easier for them to imagine objects they would bring if they, say, lived in a different time and place? We're not actually like say we're reading about the things they carried, so they have to
right,
imagine themselves as these fictional characters or as Vietnamese refugees or children on
right,
the Kinder transport, as opposed to
right.
thinking through their own lives.
Yes. So for those who are particularly resistant to using their personal lives, I do think that using whether the fictional content or not some non-fictional content that you're working with, and getting them to almost do the work of imagination can be really useful. And I've been in certain situations where I've heard from students and even from some teachers like, "Ugh, that can feel really icky, the idea of them like imagining themselves to be, refugees or enslaved people or things like that, like,
Mhm.
worries about appropriation, misappropriation, and questions of authenticity. I get that. Um, and maybe the thing that I am even more worried about than that is the refusal to engage at all. Like, if someone's like, I don't want to get personal. So, what do I mean by that? It's one thing if someone says, I don't want to get personal, but ultimately they are engaging with the skills building content work. Like, can't really be too mad about that. But for someone who doesn't want to engage and who is avoiding the skills building content work, and it seems like there's something deeper going on, then yeah, I'm like, okay, if we can use this tool of engaging the imagination and having them do maybe some of the work of imagination and critical literacy of imagining themselves in the world of a story, and that works, ultimately I'm all for it. I mean, it's not like we're going to post that online, I would hope. So yeah, for sure. Robin.
All right, another question.
Yeah.
So I'm really into group work, right? I have like usually 3 units in the semester, and I like to have students like be in units for a little while. So like 5 units, so they get to know each other, and then we switch out so people have more opportunities. So question one, have you utilized group work in this dynamic? Like how would group work fit
Hmm.
this dynamic? And then B, have you ever done, or I mean, do you envision, like I'm thinking, how could this be a great, I don't think this would happen at the beginning of my semester, but how could this be a really great kind of mid-semester or late semester piece where we then get to enjoy kind of a gallery walk around the
Yeah.
objects, or some sort of
Yes.
poster that they created about their object or something. So have you ever done anything like that?
So the latter, yes. And in a certain sense, the that's where I guess the most fleshed out notion of the group is, demonstrated. Like, look at all of these stories, look at all of these objects that are represented here, and look at what we are carrying with us. So yes to that. I think it would be, I haven't done as much group work in terms of the module more broadly, other than like group shares. But if there actually was some interesting, deeper group work that's possible, I'd be super into that. I know that you inevitably have students who are like, some love group work, and others are like, I don't you dare put me with another person beyond sharing, because I'm going to be carrying them or they're going to be disappointed in me. So it's like always a balance of that. But since you have done so much group work, I'm sure there's what to learn from, what you've done there. And I'd be super curious to learn, what you would learn from potentially doing that. So
Okay. Yeah. So just to
very game.
clarify, most of the time when they're in groups and I make them do group work, I make them do it in that moment. Right?
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
like you're
Got
here,
it.
you're doing it in this moment.
Yeah.
I mean, I've also done work where there is group work where they have to submit something at the end that they've done independently. Most of the
Okay.
time, there's exactly the problems you mentioned. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I'm just
Yeah.
thinking about it.
Yeah. And I mean,
Thanks.
ultimately, as even though I do a lot of this arts and culture work, ultimately I am a rabbi. So it's like I have to appreciate the what I would call almost like the ritual technology of being in pairs or groups, which in Jewish learning and culture is chavruta, and there are so many stories that are told in like Jewish literature specifically traditional literature, about like what is the purpose of clavruta. And the idea, but one of the ones that I love most is this idea of iron sharpening iron. It's like ultimately it is by being in relationship with someone else and having that dynamic, that back and forth, that dialectic, that ultimately pushes us to think more about like, who am I? What am I bringing? What is my contribution? And so, I mean, group work, when it works, is incredible. So yeah.
Thanks.
Last questions or comments before I say maybe one last word and then hand it back over.
So,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
That's great.
My question is, in your experience, have you found that this exercise, we'll say, fosters cross-cultural empathy between participants from different
Yes.
diasporas, even those that are at war with each other?
Yes. So the short answer is yes, but the way of building up to that is essential. And I am the first person to say, like, that's one of those cases where you might need to look towards like partnerships with other faculty who have already built trust with the communities that you might specifically be thinking about. Like, so yes, it can absolutely build empathy, but you have to be really, really careful and thoughtful about it. So I'm trying to think of maybe a more like a more compressed example rather than something that will just take too long to explain. Yeah, here we go. So I was doing some consulting work. So this has less to do with this project, but more of an example from the broader consulting work that I've done. Was doing a consulting project with my colleague. We were doing it for a major media company, and it was professional development for their staff that's located in like many different countries. And this was in the middle of not the present set of wars, but the war between Israel, Hamas, and Palestine, like in the previous session. And one of the things that we did, because like we could talk about countries all day. We could talk about peoplehood. We could talk about all of these things. But what we did was we centered the personal narrative, and we didn't diminish. And we centered like, look, we are here to talk about like Jewish multicultural representation, but ultimately it is important. Like, we can't diminish the suffering that any person, family might be experiencing in this moment. And we can't particularly justify one thing versus another thing. So ultimately, what is it that we did in that moment by naming that? We were communicating that we aren't trying to represent any one particular governmental entity. We aren't trying to represent one particular perspective and juxtapose that as right versus another perspective. Instead, what we're doing is focusing on who are we as human beings, and how is it that we approach this work, and how we ultimately need to be open to hearing the pain, the cri de coeur of someone else. And sometimes that's really going to chafe up against who we are and what we identify with, but ultimately finding ways to expand our compassion and the horizon of our compassion to like really hear those stories. That is part of the work of being human. That is part of the work of the humanities. So like we said that in a way that was a bit more business friendly to Spotify, but ultimately we believe that very much. So I would say it is not easy. Find your allies. Find your allies across multiple points of identity. Know that you are probably going to screw up, but ultimately, when you screw up, name that you screwed up and try to bring as many people into that intellectual community as possible. It tends to go better that way, and focusing more on individual stories, even if they are illustrative of broader systemic stories, like the more individual, usually the better it goes. So, but it's hard. It's really hard. Um, all right. So I think we're at time, and we have 5 minutes. So I want to thank you all for just taking the time to join me today. You could have been anywhere in the world, and the fact that you chose to spend some time with me is a real treat. So thank you. I hope that you, if you're not done with the semester, that you finish strong. I hope you have a lovely summer, some good research ahead of you. And I'm going to turn it back over to Victoria, Allison, and Laura.
Hi. Okay. So yeah, you may have noticed that I wrote in the chat if anyone is interested in participating in this initiative. Yeah, I mean, whether or not you work at QCC or another CUNY institution, I would love if were to keep in touch, and you could always email me. I do plan on having a kind of meeting to brainstorm how we might use this in our class and collaborate, and then also just exchange ideas. So you can write to me, and yeah, email is always great. And at some point, I'm going to email everyone on, who registered for the event too, just to keep you updated on this. But if anyone has questions or thoughts, I'd love to hear. Okay.
Allison?
Thank you all so much. Kendall, this was wonderful. I think for all of us still here, it gave us a lot to think about. And I know many people regretted that they had other meetings to attend. So I just wanted to share that it's just such a pleasure to be here with you today. And thank you, Laura Barana and the Kupferberg Holocaust Center for making this possible. And we will be in touch with people as well about integrating this into their courses and connecting with the KHC more. Thank you.
Thank you, Kendall. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Allison, everyone that joined us today. Kendall, that last piece you were talking about, who are we to deny or judge somebody else's experience and suffering, and thinking of it as individuals really resonated. And also even at the beginning when you were talking about how do you share testimonies with students and doing it in a way that's sort of multimodal, all of these things really, really resonate. So the last thing I'll leave with you all is I always travel with my Raggedy Ann and Andy. They're these two little ones that are hugging wherever I go in the world. And they're specific ones from the 70s, which date me. I have a collection of them. They're in my apartment. I am that lady that has all her dolls out. But it also just resonated with like, what would I bring at that minute? And something that would be practical, but something also that is meaningful that I hope would travel. So thank you to everyone. And we will be following up with you soon. Stay safe, be well, everyone. Bye-bye.